Well, surprisingly, Kennedy backed Lodge and Rusk and gave his approval to support the coup against Zia. So he went against his brother, he went against the Secretary of Defense, and he went against General Maxwell Taylor, and he said, no, I think this is what we need to do. Zia's out of control, this isn't working, I will back it. Now by backing it, what does that mean? Did we commit ourselves like we did at the Bay of Pigs? No, we just said, you have our blessing. Okay? You have our blessing. So it would be the job of the South Vietnamese military to get this done. So, on November 1st of 1963, the South Vietnamese military acted and were successful in overthrowing Zia. So on November 1st of 1963, the South Vietnamese military acted and were successful. They disposed of Prime Minister Diem of power. Okay? Now, lots of times if you overthrow a government, you'll take their leader and exile them to what? Another country, put them in the jungles of Brazil, wherever. Well, to Kennedy's shock and horror, what did the South Vietnamese military do to Zia? Executed him. Executed him. And that made Kennedy upset because when he talked to the people about this in initial conversations, he said, if I go with this and you're successful, you're going to exile Zia to another country. But they executed him instead. Okay? Now, once he was executed, there were people that were telling Kennedy, I think we can't let South Vietnam fall. Can't do it. Even though Zia's overthrown, we got to get involved. We got to get involved in this thing. Now, I'm going to give you, just want you to listen to this. So, after the assassination of Diem, Kennedy's Joint Chiefs, those would be his military advisors, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and National Security Advisor Bundy, we talked about all these people, told President Kennedy, quote, we can't let South Vietnam fall. It will endanger all of Southeast Asia. So what are they pushing for? Us to get involved militarily. Okay? And again, the three people that were after him, more than three, were Kennedy's Joint Chiefs of Staff, his generals in each branch of the military. Even though Maxwell Taylor didn't believe in the coup, once it happened and Diem was assassinated, he thought, uh-oh, we better make sure we control South Vietnam now. We don't want it to fall to communism. Okay? So did Secretary of State Rusk, and so did National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy. Now, who was on the other side that Kennedy listened to? What? Bobby, but he had the ear of somebody else that he really respected. Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield of Montana. On the other side, Mansfield knew the region. He had visited the region, and he continued to tell President Kennedy, it's a quagmire. If you go in with an army, you'll never get out. That's what Mansfield told Kennedy very early in the Vietnam conflict. Senator Mansfield said to Kennedy, it's a quagmire. If you go in with an army, you will never get out. Mansfield told him that while he was getting pressure. So, late in his administration, before his assassination, he's getting pressure to go in militarily. Okay, from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Secretary of State Rusk, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, all saying, man, we got to go in. We can't let this thing fall. Mansfield's been there, said, it's a quagmire. If you send troops in, you'll never get out. So Kennedy's getting this from both sides.
How did you know?
How did Mansfield know that? He was there. He saw the situation. That was his opinion. Don't go into Vietnam. You'll never get out. It's a mess. Well, where was Kennedy at? What was he going to do? Now, I want you just to listen to this. President Kennedy, feeling somewhat responsible for what had happened to Prime Minister Zia, was going to lean toward non-involvement. That's what the story was at the time. However, just 3 weeks later, what happened? He was assassinated. Okay? So historians will tell you that according to the history of this, Kennedy was feeling responsible somewhat for the assassination of Diem. But even though he was feeling bad about that, because that was not his intention, you don't want to order the assassination of another country's leader. Even he didn't want to do that to Fidel Castro in Cuba that he hated. Can you imagine his surprise when they assassinated the leader of a non-communist country? Even though he felt bad about that, historians will think that he was leading towards non-involvement. However, we'll really never know, although we can guess, because he was assassinated before he could make any decisions. Now here's the key to this, and then I'm going to quit lecturing and read an excerpt from a book. Historians believe, well, I've got to get ahead of myself. Who takes over after Kennedy's assassination? Johnson. And right after the assassination, when Johnson was questioned on Vietnam and the role of America in Vietnam, this is a quote he said, quote, "I'm not going to be the president who saw Vietnam go the way China went." Think about that quote. When he was asked after the assassination of President Kennedy, his intentions on Vietnam, he said, quote, "I am not going to be the president who saw Vietnam go the way China went." What's he saying? Which way is he going to lead? Militarily, no question, and that's where we're going to be at as we continue the lecture. Now, historians believe that President Kennedy never could have imagined in 1963 what the United States was doing in Vietnam 10 years later. If you'd looked at Kennedy in 1963 before he was assassinated and said, "This is what Vietnam's like in 1973, and you'll learn about that," he would have just never believed it in his lifetime, that we ever would have gone to that extent in Vietnam. He just would not have believed that. Okay? Now, I want to read from this book here, Kennedy Lives, so I'd like your attention. And this is some more information on a conversation about South Vietnam. Now, this is talking about just before Kennedy went to Dallas. Actually, during the time he was en route to Dallas before his assassination, this was some advice and some information. So please listen carefully. And as far as South Vietnam, for almost 3 years, his advisors had been giving him such conflicting advice that he had once asked two of them, "Are you sure you two are talking about the same country? Is the South Vietnamese army, with the help of 15,000 American advisors, making any headway against the Viet Cong guerrillas? Is the government of Diem winning the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese people?" Diem and his brother had seemed more interested in suppressing the majority than in dealing with the corruption and incompetence in their own governments. Which is why 3 weeks ago, a band of generals with U.S. support had overthrown the brothers in a coup that was supposed to leave Diem and his brother unharmed. Instead, they had been shot to death in the back of a truck. And while his Joint Chiefs in Rusket State and Bundy in the White House were telling him, "We can't let South Vietnam fall, it will endanger all of Southeast Asia," others, Ken Galbraith, his Indian ambassador, which means ambassador of India, Senator Mike Mansfield, who knew the region, and General Charles de Gaulle of France, were telling him, "It's a quagmire. If you go in with an army, you will never get out." Even his own George Ball had said flatly that if the United States went in with ground troops, it would have 300,000 in Vietnam within a year. That idea was nuts, of course, he told George, but still, wait till you see how many Johnson had in there. He's predicting 300,000, George Ball, and Kennedy thinks he's out of his mind. Wait till you see how many ends up there. As for his own instincts, well, just yesterday in Washington, at the end of a meeting with a young State Department aide, Mike Forrestal, he beckoned him back in the Oval Office. "Wait a minute," Kennedy said. "After the first of the year, I want you to organize an in-depth study of every possible option we've got in Vietnam, including how to get out. We have to review this whole thing from the bottom to the top." But he was also a man of finely honed political instincts, and they told him he couldn't cut his losses now, even if he wanted to. Not with an election coming up. Not with the prospect that the Republicans would yell, "Who lost Vietnam?" just the way they and a lot of Democrats had yelled, "Who lost China?" at Truman back in '49. Who was one of the critical people of Truman in 49 for losing Korea? Kennedy as a senator, okay? That's why he told Kenneth O'Donnell, Mike Mansfield, and everyone else that nothing was going to happen in Vietnam until after he was re-elected. For God's sake, all anyone had to do was look at the full-page ad in the Dallas Morning News, boarded in black, paid for by H.L. Hunt and a group of Dallas businessmen on the far right, more or less accusing him of treason. Remember the posters, wanted for treason? So this is saying that he had no intention of even dealing with Vietnam until after he was re-elected. We're heading into nut country today, he said to Jackie, not mentioning to her that his UN ambassador Adlai Stevenson had been met with such a violent demonstration at a recent speech that Adlai had passed the word to the White House that it might be just as well for the president not to go to that city. So all of this is being discussed just before he's heading into Dallas. And with his assassination in Dallas, it opens the door. Now we're going to talk about a piece of legislation that was passed by Congress called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution tomorrow. The most gruesome, brutal, terrible piece of legislation this country has ever passed that leads us into this quagmire called the Vietnam War and will lead us to 58,000 American deaths. It's the most important, bad piece of legislation you'll ever hear about. Okay? Good job today. We'll continue this on. We're going to work pretty hard and try to get as far as we can and through this before we leave for D.C.